Hello, and welcome back to another journey through time. If you're new here, welcome. Find a comfortable position. Let your body sink into whatever surface is supporting you right now. There's nowhere else you need to be. Nothing else you need to do. Tonight we're going to explore something that might surprise you. Something that connects us to people who lived thousands of years ago. We're going to sit at their dinner tables, watch how they ate, and discover that almost everything about mealtime in biblical times would shock us today. What if I told you that burping at dinner was actually a compliment? That everyone's hands went into the same bowl of food? That you'd never once in your entire life use a fork or a spoon? That eating grasshoppers was perfectly normal? And that who you ate with could get you killed? These aren't just curious facts. They're windows into a completely different world. A world where food meant something deeper than nutrition. Where sharing a meal was the most intimate thing you could do with another person. Where the dinner table was where society happened. Where deals were made. Where enemies became friends. Or where friends became enemies. Take a deep breath with me now. In through your nose. Hold it gently and release slowly through your mouth. Let any tension in your shoulders melt away. Soften your jaw. Relax your forehead. Tonight's journey will take us through the kitchens and marketplaces of ancient Israel. We'll discover why meat was a party, not a meal. Why blood was absolutely forbidden, but bone marrow was a delicacy. Why the early Christian church almost split over meat sold in pagan markets. We'll meet people who complained about miracle food, and a prophet who survived on nothing but bugs and wild honey. You don't need to remember any of this. Just let the images wash over you. Let your mind wander through dusty streets and smoky cooking fires. Smell the bread baking. Feel the warmth of the sun. Hear the chatter of the marketplace. We'll spend about 2 hours together. So settle in. Close your eyes if you haven't already. And let's drift back in time. Back to a world where dinner was never boring, even when the food was. Let's begin. Imagine sitting down to dinner tonight, and there's no silverware on the table, no fork, no spoon, no knife, not because someone forgot to set the table, but because these things simply don't exist in your world. They haven't been invented yet, and honestly, no one misses them. This was reality for everyone in biblical times, rich or poor, king or beggar. Everyone ate with their hands, every single meal, for their entire lives. Now, before you picture chaos and mess, understand that this was an art form. There were rules, techniques, an entire etiquette around hand eating that took years to master. The secret tool, bread. Bread was your fork, your spoon, your napkin. And then, at the end, you ate the utensil itself. Imagine that. Flat bread still warm from the clay oven, torn into pieces with your right hand. Always your right hand, never the left. The left hand had other duties, bathroom duties, and a world without toilet paper. So the left hand stayed in your lap during meals, touching it to food or to the communal bowls. That would horrify everyone at the table. They might ask you to leave. It was that serious. With your right hand, you'd tear off a piece of bread, maybe the size of your palm. You'd fold it, pinch it between your thumb, index finger, and middle finger, forming a little scoop, and then you'd reach toward the center of the table, where a large pottery bowl sat steaming. Inside that bowl might be a thick lentil stew, or a mixture of vegetables cooked in olive oil, or on special occasions, small pieces of lamb or goat meat in a rich sauce. You dip your bread scoop into the bowl, letting it soak up the liquid, gathering some of the chunks, and bring it to your mouth. The bread would be soft from the moisture, warm from the stew, and flavored with cumin, coriander, garlic. You'd take a bite, chewing slowly, savoring it. And here's something that might surprise you. Licking your fingers was not only acceptable, it was expected. It was efficient. It showed you appreciated the food. This method of eating had a name, the sop, or the morsel, a piece of bread wrapped around food, and it appears in one of the most dramatic moments in the Bible. At the Last Supper, Jesus takes a sop, dips it in the dish, and hands it directly to Judas. Think about that for a moment. In that culture, hand-feeding someone was incredibly intimate. It was an act of honor, of closeness. Jesus, knowing Judas would betray him within hours, still performed this gesture of friendship, still offered him food from his own hand. The tragedy is even deeper when you understand what that meant. Eating with your hands meant your hands were constantly covered in food. Olive oil, rich and golden, would coat your fingers. Honey from dried dates would make them sticky. Meat juices would run down to your wrists. And this was normal. This was every meal. So before eating, there was always hand washing. Not because they understood germs. They didn't. Bacteria wouldn't be discovered for another 1,000+ years. But ritual purity mattered deeply. Religious law required washing. So before every meal, servants would bring around large bowls of water, and you'd pour water over your right hand, carefully, methodically. Sometimes the Pharisees would wash up to their elbows, multiple times. They had elaborate rituals, which makes it even more shocking when Jesus' disciples didn't wash before eating. The Pharisees were horrified. Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat. Jesus' response? He said they worried about the outside of the cup while ignoring what's inside their hearts. He flipped the whole conversation from physical cleanliness to spiritual condition. But that's a different story. The point is, hands were everything. Your hands touched the food that touched other people's hands. You passed bread to your neighbor. They tore a piece with their hands. You dipped in the same bowl they just dipped in. Eating together meant literally sharing, mingling, trusting. In our modern world, we barely touch our own food. We use metal tools to move it from plate to mouth. We eat from individual portions, often alone, often looking at screens. We've lost something. This tactile connection to our food. This necessary trust in the people we eat with. But in biblical times, every meal required vulnerability, required trust, required community. And it started with the simple act of reaching out your hand, tearing bread, and sharing it with whoever sat beside you. Let's stay at that dinner table a little longer, because we need to talk about something that would make a modern health inspector shut down the operation immediately. There were no individual plates, no personal portions. Everything, and I mean everything, was served in communal bowls placed in the center of the table, or rather the center of the floor, because people often sat on the ground around a low table or a cloth spread with food. One large pottery bowl, filled with lentil stew or chickpea mash, or vegetables cooked with chunks of bread already mixed in, and everyone ate from it. at the same time with their hands. Picture this. Your hand goes into the stew. You scoop some out with your bread, then your neighbor's hand goes in, right where yours just was. Then someone across from you reaches in, stirring the stew with their fingers while grabbing their portion. Then you go back in for seconds and thirds, your hand touching the same food, the same liquid that 10 other hands are touching. Hands that were just washed, yes, but still, in our post-pandemic world, this sounds like a nightmare. We can barely share a bag of chips without anxiety now. But they had no concept of germs, no microscopes, no understanding of bacteria or viruses. What they did have was an obsessive concern with ritual purity, with being clean or unclean in a spiritual sense. Touching certain things made you unclean. Being around certain people made you unclean. And if you were unclean, you couldn't worship at the temple. You couldn't participate fully in community life. So the hand washing before meals, critical, but not for the reasons we'd think. They weren't trying to kill germs. They were trying to maintain ritual purity, to follow God's commands, to stay in right relationship with the holy. The irony is beautiful. They were so careful about spiritual cleanliness, while unknowingly sharing all manner of physical bacteria and viruses. And yet, communities survived. Families grew. People lived long enough to become elders and grandparents. There's something else happening in this communal bowl, something deeper than hygiene. When you eat from the same dish as someone, when your hands touch the same food their hands touch, you're saying something without words. You're saying, I trust you. You're saying, we're family, or we're friends, or we're allies. Which is why it was such a big deal when Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners. Not just that he was in the same room with them, but that he was dipping his hand into the same bowl they were dipping into. His food was touching their food. In that culture, this meant full acceptance, full fellowship, full identification. The Pharisees understood this. That's why they were so scandalized. He eats with sinners wasn't just an observation. It was an accusation, because sharing a bowl meant sharing life. And this makes the Judas moment even more pointed. At the Last Supper, Jesus said, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me." He wasn't just identifying Judas. He was highlighting the intimacy being violated. They had shared the bowl. They had shared life. And now that bond would be broken in the worst possible way. The communal bowl created vulnerability. If you had enemies, you didn't eat with them, because poisoning was a real concern. You only ate from a shared bowl with people you trusted. People who trusted you. The meal itself was a statement. Think about our world now. We eat alone more than any generation in human history. Individual meals, individual plates, individual screens. We've gained hygiene, we've gained convenience, but we've lost something profound. We've lost the forced intimacy of the shared bowl, the required trust, the vulnerability that builds community. The way that eating together used to mean something deeper than just consuming calories at the same time. In biblical times, you couldn't eat without trusting. You couldn't have a meal without building relationship. Every dinner was a small act of faith. Faith that the people around you cared about your well-being. Faith that you were safe. Faith that you belonged. And maybe, just maybe, as you drift off to sleep tonight, You might dream of a different kind of meal, where the food matters less than the people, where trust is served alongside stew, where reaching your hand into the bowl means reaching toward community. Now let's leave the village dinner table and walk out into the wilderness, the rocky, harsh, unforgiving wilderness of Judea, where water is scarce, where shade is rare, where most plants have thorns to protect their moisture, and where one man made his home, eating a diet that most of us couldn't stomach for even one day. His name was John, John the Baptizer, and Matthew's Gospel tells us something very specific about what he ate. His food was locusts and wild honey. That's it. That was the menu. Bugs and honey, every day, for years. And here's the thing. This wasn't a survival situation where he was eating locusts because he was desperate. This was a choice, a lifestyle. And in that culture, it wasn't even particularly strange. Let's talk about locusts first. These are large grasshopper-like insects that travel in massive swarms. We're talking millions of insects, darkening the sky, landing on every surface, devouring crops, leaving devastation behind. Locusts were a plague, literally one of the plagues God sent on Egypt. But they were also food, perfectly legal food according to Jewish dietary law. Leviticus chapter 11 lists the insects you're allowed to eat. Of the insects that walk on all fours, you may eat those that have jointed legs for hopping on the ground. You may eat any kind of locust, katydid, cricket, or grasshopper. So John wasn't breaking any rules. He was eating kosher insects. But why? Why would someone choose this? First, they were free, especially during swarming season. You could gather hundreds in minutes. Just reach out and grab them from bushes, from rocks, from the air. No hunting required. No trapping. No payment, just collection. Second, they were protein. Rich, concentrated protein in a landscape where meat was rare and expensive. One handful of locusts could provide the nutrition of a full meal, and in the wilderness where John lived, protein was hard to come by. Third, there was a certain poetic justice to it. These creatures that destroyed people's crops and caused famine, now they become food themselves. You eat the thing that ate your livelihood. There's something satisfying about that. But how do you prepare a locust? I'm so glad you're wondering. Even if you're slightly disgusted, stay with me. The most common method was roasting. You'd build a small fire, let it burn down to hot coals, then place the locusts directly on the coals or on flat rocks near the heat. As they roasted, their bodies would darken, their legs would curl, and they'd develop a toasted, nutty smell, not unlike roasting seeds or nuts. Some people would pull off the wings and legs first. Others would eat them whole. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The texture was crispy. The flavor described by modern people who still eat locusts. And yes, people still do in many parts of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. The flavor is mild, nutty, a little bit like sunflower seeds. Some say like toasted grain. You could also dry them in the sun. Once dried, they'd keep for months. You could grind them into a flour and mix them with other grains, or just eat them as a crunchy snack, like biblical trail mix, except it's all bugs. John probably roasted them fresh most days. Gathered them in the morning when they were sluggish from the cool night air, tossed them on hot stones, ate them for breakfast, protein accomplished, and then the honey, wild honey. This wasn't honey from a beekeeper's managed hives. There were no beekeepers. This was honey from wild bees who built their hives in crevices of rocks, in hollow trees, in caves. Honey where they could find shelter. Finding wild honey was dangerous. Bees don't appreciate you stealing their food. And these weren't domesticated gentle bees. These were wild bees who would swarm and sting repeatedly. But if you could brave the stings, if you could smoke them out, if you could extract the honeycomb, you'd have something precious. Honey was liquid gold. Literally, it was sweet, intensely sweet, in a world where sugar didn't exist, where fruit was the only other source of sweetness. And fruit was seasonal. Honey was medicine. It helped wounds heal. It soothed sore throats. It provided quick energy. And it was stable. Honey doesn't spoil. Archaeologists have found honey in Egyptian tombs that's thousands of years old, still edible. So as John found a good hive, he could harvest a substantial amount, store it in a leather pouch or a hollowed gourd, and have sweetness for weeks. The combination makes sense now, doesn't it? The locusts provided protein and substance. The honey provided quick energy and sweetness. Together they were a complete wilderness diet. Unconventional, yes, but effective. And there's something else, something symbolic. John was calling people to return to the wilderness experience, to remember when Israel wandered in the desert, depending on God for everything. His clothing was camel hair, rough and uncomfortable. His food was wild and foraged. He was living out the message he preached. Return, repent, strip away the comfortable civilization, and remember what matters. Today, entomophagy. That's the technical term for eating insects, is being reconsidered. Insects are more sustainable than cattle. They require less water, less land, less food to raise. They produce less greenhouse gas. Some scientists say eating insects could help solve world hunger. Maybe John was ahead of his time, or maybe he was calling back to a time before our modern squeamishness, when food was food, when you ate what was available, when a crunchy roasted locust on a hot day in the wilderness, dipped in wild honey, was simply breakfast as you drift deeper into rest. Imagine the simplicity of that life. No refrigerators to stock, no grocery stores to navigate, no decisions about what's for dinner, just the land, the season, what God provides, locusts when they swarm, honey when you can find it, and the strange freedom of needing so little, of being satisfied with so much less than we think we need. Let's walk back towards civilization now, back to the villages and small towns dotting the landscape of ancient Israel. And let's talk about something that might change how you read the Bible whenever you see a feast, a celebration, a meal with meat. Understand this. That was a rare and extraordinary event. In our modern world, at least in wealthy countries, meat is ordinary. You can have chicken for lunch, beef for dinner, bacon for breakfast. We eat meat multiple times a day if we want to. It's in the refrigerator or the freezer, waiting for us, preserved, safe, ready whenever. But in biblical times, there were no refrigerators, no freezers, no ice, no way to preserve fresh meat for more than a few hours, especially in the Middle Eastern heat, where temperatures regularly climbed above 90, 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So when an animal was slaughtered, that meat had to be eaten immediately. that same day, within hours, and one animal produces a lot of meat, more than one family could possibly eat before it spoiled, which meant meat was automatically communal. You couldn't slaughter a sheep just for your family. You'd waste most of it. So when an animal was killed, the entire neighborhood got involved. Everyone was invited. Everyone shared. It became an event, a party, a celebration. This is why biblical feasts are such a big deal. They're not just about religion or ritual. They're about the rare opportunity to eat meat, to taste fat and richness, to have something other than bread and lentils and onions. Think about the story of the prodigal son. The younger son returns home after squandering his inheritance. And the father's response? Quick, bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. A fattened calf. This wasn't just any cow. This was an animal they'd been feeding extra grain to, preparing for a special occasion, maybe being saved for a wedding or a major festival. And the father says, kill it now, for this boy who wasted everything. Kill it and invite everyone. The older brother's anger makes more sense when you understand this. His father just slaughtered their most valuable animal, probably worth months of work, for a party the older brother never got. You never even gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. He's not exaggerating. He's pointing out that the father never threw a party for him, never killed meat for him, because meat wasn't casual. It was costly. In every sense. Most people in biblical times ate meat only a few times a year, maybe at Passover, maybe at a wedding, maybe at harvest festivals. The daily diet was grain-based. Bread, lots of bread, barley bread for the poor. Wheat bread if you were better off, lentils, beans, chickpeas, cooked into thick stews or mashed into paste. Onions, garlic, leeks, these were the flavor. The vegetables that grew easily and kept relatively well. Olives, olive oil on everything. Dried figs. Dried dates when you could afford them. Fresh fruit in season. Grapes, pomegranates. And if you lived near the Sea of Galilee, fish. Fish was more common than other meat because it could be caught fresh daily, or dried and salted for preservation. This is why so many of Jesus' miracles involved fish, and why several of his disciples were fishermen. Fish was the protein source for that region. But inland, away from the water, most people lived on a nearly vegetarian diet, not by choice, simply by economic and practical necessity. Meat spoiled. Meat was expensive. Meat required slaughter. And animals were more valuable alive than dead. A sheep gave you wool. A goat gave you milk. A cow could plow your field. Why would you kill them except for something special? This is why Abraham running to prepare a feast for his mysterious visitors was such a big deal. He had them kill a calf, a tender, choice calf, immediately, for strangers. That's radical hospitality. That's sacrificial. That's saying you matter more than my wealth. This is why Job's wealth was measured partly in animals. 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen. This wasn't just assets. This was food security. This was potential feasts. This was power, and this is why Jesus multiplying loaves and fish was so miraculous. Not just that he created food from nothing, but that he gave the crowd fish, protein, something rare and precious, something most of them rarely got to eat. He wasn't just preventing hunger. He was giving them abundance, the kind of meal they'd remember for years. The morning markets in every town operated on this principle. If you wanted fresh food, you went early. The best fish came in with the morning catch. Bread was baked at dawn while the air was still cool. Any meat that did appear was sold and cooked quickly. By afternoon, most fresh food was gone, wilted or already showing signs of spoilage. This is why salt was so valuable. It was one of the only preservation methods available. Salted fish could last weeks. Salted meat could travel. Salt was literally paid as wages, the root of our word salary. So tonight as you rest, maybe you can feel a little differently about the food in your refrigerator, the meat in your freezer, the casual luxury of eating whatever you want, whenever you want, without needing to invite the whole neighborhood. Without needing to make it an event. In biblical times, every meat meal was memorable, was special, was shared. And maybe, just maybe, that made it taste even better. Because scarcity creates appreciation, and knowing this might be your only taste of lamb for another year might make you savor it more slowly, chew more thoughtfully, remember it more vividly. The feast wasn't just about the food, it was about the rarity, the community, the celebration, the fact that for one evening, everyone had enough and more than enough, and no one worried about tomorrow. Now we need to talk about something that defined kosher eating, something that separated Jewish dietary laws from the surrounding cultures. Something that seems arbitrary until you understand the theology behind it, the absolute prohibition against consuming blood. Leviticus chapter 17, verses 10 through 14. God speaking through Moses, I will set my face against any Israelite or any foreigner residing among them who eats blood, and I will cut them off from the people. For the life of a creature is in the blood. Therefore I say to the Israelites, you must not eat the blood of any creature, because the life of every creature is its blood. Life is in the blood. This wasn't a health regulation. This was theological. Blood represented the soul, the life force, the essence of the creature, and life belonged to God alone. So blood could be used in sacrifices, poured out as an offering, but never consumed, never treated as ordinary food. This meant elaborate rules for slaughter. The animal's throat had to be cut in a specific way, allowing the blood to drain out quickly and completely. Then the remaining blood had to be covered with earth, a symbolic burial. A recognition that something sacred had been released. Even today, kosher meat goes through additional salting and soaking processes to remove every last trace of blood. The laws haven't changed in thousands of years. Blood remains absolutely forbidden. But here's what's fascinating. While blood was completely off limits, bone marrow was not only acceptable, it was considered a delicacy, a treat, something special. Bone marrow is the soft, fatty tissue inside bones. In our modern diet, we barely think about it. But in a biblical-era diet that was generally low in fat, marrow was richness itself. It was butter, it was cream, it was luxurious flavor after a rare meat meal. After the flesh had been eaten, the bones remained, and those bones held treasure inside them. So people would place the bones directly into the fire, or onto hot stones in the clay oven, and roast them until they were hot all the way through. Then, with careful hands, they'd crack the bones open, sometimes with stones, sometimes with the back of a knife, and inside. Melted, almost liquid from the heat, rich and fatty and golden. You'd scoop it out with bread, or sometimes just tilt the bone and let it slide onto your tongue. The taste was intense, buttery, savory, utterly satisfying in a way that lean meat alone could never be. Archaeological digs at ancient Israelite sites have found countless bones, and many of them show specific marks, split marks, cracks made deliberately to access the marrow inside. This wasn't rare behavior. This was standard practice. When you had bones, you harvested the marrow. You didn't waste it. There's even a reference to this in Micah chapter 3, where the prophet is condemning evil rulers, and he uses this metaphor. You eat my people's flesh, strip off their skin, and break their bones in pieces. You chop them up like meat for the pan, like flesh for the pot. The image includes breaking bones, because that's what you did with food bones. You broke them open for the marrow. The contrast is striking, isn't it? Blood absolutely forbidden because it represents life and soul, but marrow perfectly acceptable because it's just fat, just nutrition. It doesn't carry the same symbolic weight. This is a reminder that biblical food laws weren't primarily about health. They were about holiness, about distinction, about remembering that Israel was set apart, different from the nations around them who did consume blood in various rituals and meals. When Peter has his vision in Acts chapter 10, his sheet coming down from heaven with all kinds of animals, clean and unclean, and a voice saying, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." Peter's response is visceral. "Surely not, Lord. I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." These weren't just preferences. These were identity. These were thousands of years of teaching and practice. These were the boundaries that defined who you were as one of God's people. And yet God was saying, the boundaries are changing. The distinctions are shifting. What was unclean can be made clean, because something bigger is happening. The gospel is going to the Gentiles. The message is spreading beyond Jewish culture, and the food laws that separated Jew from Gentile are about to become complicated. But we'll get to that tension later. For now, just let yourself imagine the simple pleasure of hot bone marrow on fresh bread, the richness coating your mouth, the satisfaction of extracting something precious from what others might discard, the practical wisdom of using every part of the animal, wasting nothing, honoring the life that was given by consuming it fully. Rest in that image, the warmth of fire-roasted bones, the golden treasure inside, the deep nourishment of fat in a lean world, and let it carry you deeper into sleep. Let's return once more to the dinner table, but this time, let's pay attention not to the food, but to the behavior. Because if you could somehow time travel back to a biblical era meal, you'd be shocked, maybe even appalled, by what was considered perfectly polite. Let's start with something that would get you in trouble at almost any modern dinner table. Burping, loud, satisfied, audible burping, at a meal in ancient Israel. That was a compliment. That was you telling your host, "This food is so good, I'm completely satisfied." It was a sign of contentment, a fullness of appreciation. A quiet, reserved diner who ate without any physical response, that might actually be concerning. Are they not enjoying the food? Are they still hungry? Are they uncomfortable? The body's responses to eating were natural, expected, even encouraged. And speaking of natural responses, remember how everyone ate with their hands? Well, those hands got messy, covered in oil and sauce and honey and meat juices. And what did you do about that? You licked your fingers clean, thoroughly, one by one, making sure no food was wasted. And then, if there were particularly flavorful oils or sauces left in the bottom of the communal bowl, you might use bread to wipe it clean, soaking up every last bit. And that bread became the most flavorful bite of all. This wasn't considered gross. This was efficient. This was appreciative. This was making sure nothing went to waste in a world where waste was a luxury no one could afford. Talking with your mouth full, almost unavoidable when you're eating with your hands and tearing bread and dipping while conversing. Meals were social events. Silence during dinner would actually be strange, suspicious even. If everyone's quiet, something's wrong. Someone's angry or grieving, or the tension is unbearable. No, a good meal was noisy. People talking over each other, laughing, debating, telling stories. And yes, doing all of this while actively eating, because the meal was about community first, food second. The point wasn't to efficiently consume nutrients in silence. The point was to be together, to strengthen bonds, to share life. And here's something that really requires explanation. Most people didn't sit in chairs at tables, at least not the way we think of it. The Roman influence had introduced reclining. You'd lean on your left elbow on a cushion or a couch, with your body angled, your right hand free to reach for food, your feet stretched out behind you. This is why it made sense for someone to wash Jesus' feet with her tears during a meal at Simon the Pharisee's house. His feet were accessible, extended out behind him as he reclined. If he'd been sitting in a chair, this moment wouldn't work physically. Only poor people sat on the ground or on simple stools. Children sat. Servants sat. But adults with any social standing, they reclined. It was a status symbol, a sign of leisure, a Roman-inspired custom that had spread through the Jewish world. Reclining meant you were free. Free people reclined. Slaves served. This is part of why Jesus washing his disciples' feet was so shocking. He took the position of a slave, did the work of a servant, while they were reclining like free men. And let's talk about napkins, or rather the lack of them. There were no cloth napkins, no paper napkins, nothing to wipe your hands on except the bread, the same bread you'd eventually eat. You'd use crusts to clean your fingers, then eat those crusts. Bread is napkin and food, nothing wasted. Some households might have had a basin of water passed around during the meal for rinsing, but this wasn't universal. More often you just managed. You were careful. You were practiced. You'd been eating this way your entire life. Oh, and the dogs. There were dogs at meals. Not pet dogs the way we think of them, but semi-wild dogs that hung around human settlements, eating scraps. And at mealtime they'd gather under the table or around the edges of the eating area, waiting for dropped food. And people would toss them bits deliberately, bones with a little meat still on them, bread crusts that fell, pieces that touched the floor. Jesus referenced this in his conversation with the Canaanite woman. She begged him to heal her daughter, and he said, "It's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." It sounds harsh to our ears, but he was using a common mealtime reality. The food goes to the family first, the children at the table, and then what's left goes to the dogs underneath. And her brilliant response? Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. She took his metaphor and owned it. Yes, even the dogs get fed. Even the outsiders get the overflow of your abundance. And Jesus was impressed. He healed her daughter immediately. Table arrangements showed social hierarchy too. If you were reclining, where you reclined mattered. The position closest to the host was the most honored. That's where important guests were placed. Working your way around the table, each position indicated your relative status. This is why James and John's mother asking Jesus to let her sons sit at his right and left in his kingdom was such a bold request. She was asking for the most honored positions, the highest status, right next to Jesus himself. The other disciples were furious, not just because of the presumption, but because they all wanted those spots too. And wine, everyone drank wine with meals, but never straight, always mixed with water, usually about 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Drinking wine unmixed was considered barbaric, something barbarians and drunks did. Civilized people diluted their wine, made it last longer, controlled the intoxication. Even children drank watered wine, because water alone wasn't always safe. Wells could be contaminated. Standing water carried disease. But wine, even heavily diluted wine, had some antiseptic properties. It was safer, and wine was abundant. Vineyards were common. Fermentation was understood. Wine was ordinary, while straight water was sometimes suspicious. So picture it all together now. A meal in ancient Israel. People reclining on cushions around a low table, or sitting on the ground around a spread cloth. Everyone's right hand reaching into communal bowls, fingers glistening with olive oil, conversations overlapping, laughter and debate mixed together, the sound of satisfied burps punctuating the meal, dogs waiting hopefully for scraps beneath the table, cups of watered wine being refilled, fingers being licked clean, bread crusts used as napkins, then eaten, the smell of food mixing with olive oil lamps, the warmth of bodies closed together, the intimacy of shared space and shared food. This was dinner every night, for everyone, rich or poor. The details might vary. The quality of the food might change. But the basic experience was the same, and as strange as it might sound to us, as unhygienic, as chaotic, there was something beautiful in it, something we've lost, the forced closeness, the unavoidable community, the way you couldn't eat without being with people, without trusting them, without sharing space and food and conversation. We've gained so much with our modern ways, our individual plates and metal utensils, our hygiene, and our personal space. But we've lost something too, the mandatory togetherness of the ancient meal. The way eating was always, always, an act of community. Let that image rest in your mind as you sink deeper into sleep. The noise and warmth of a biblical dinner, the laughter and argument and satisfaction, the dogs and the oil lamps and the shared bowls, the strangeness that was normal, the chaos that was actually order, just a different kind of order than we know, and rest in the knowledge that people have always gathered, always eaten, always talked and laughed and lived around food, together. Now let's step away from village life, away from the occasional feast and the daily bread, and walk back in time, further back, to the very beginning of Israel's story as a nation, to the wilderness, where 2 million people were learning to survive in a desert, with no farms, no markets, no storage, no plan, except God had a plan. And one morning, about a month after they'd escaped Egypt, after the Red Sea miracle, after the initial euphoria had worn off and reality set in, after the food they'd carried out of Egypt had run out, the people woke up to something strange. The ground was covered with dew, and when the dew evaporated in the morning sun, there on the surface of the wilderness, thin flakes, like frost, white, covering everything. "What is it?" they asked each other. In Hebrew, manhu. What is it? And that became its name, manna, the what is it food. Moses told them, "It's the bread the Lord has given you to eat." The instructions were specific. Gather as much as you need for your household, about 2 quarts per person, enough for one day. Don't try to keep it overnight. Except on Friday, gather double, because none will appear on the Sabbath. And it tasted, according to the description in Exodus, like wafers made with honey. It was white, like coriander seed. And when you ground it and cooked it, it tasted sweet, pleasant. Not amazing, but not bad. Actually quite nice. The first day, it was miraculous. Food appearing from nowhere. Enough for everyone. Free, abundant. God providing exactly what they needed. The first week, it was amazing. Every morning, there it was again. Reliable, consistent. You could count on it. The first month, it was good. You started developing recipes. Some people baked it into cakes. Others boiled it into a kind of porridge. You could add dried fruit if you had any, or honey if you found some. You could experiment. The first year it was fine. It was food. It kept you alive. You were grateful, mostly. But by year 2, year 5, year 10, imagine eating the same thing for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, every single day, for years. No variety, no change, no surprise, just manna, again, always manna. It's described in Numbers chapter 11. The rabble with them began to crave other food, and again the Israelites started wailing and said, "If only we had meat to eat." We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost, also the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna. Think about that for a moment. They were complaining about free food, miraculous food, food that appeared every morning without them having to work for it, farm it, hunt it, buy it. Food that was perfectly nutritious, that kept them alive and healthy for decades, and they were sick of it. They were remembering Egypt, slavery, oppression, brutal forced labor. But you know what? Egypt had variety. Egypt had fish from the Nile, cucumbers growing in irrigated gardens, melons sweet and juicy, leeks and onions and garlic to flavor your food. The human mind does this. It forgets the pain and remembers the flavors. It minimizes the suffering and magnifies the menu. They weren't really saying they wanted to go back to slavery. They were saying, "We're so bored with manna that even slave food sounds good right now." And God heard them. The text says God heard them. Family by family, each at the entrance to their tent, weeping, actually weeping over food boredom. Moses was frustrated too. He complained to God, "Why have you brought this trouble on me? Where can I get meat for all these people?" I can't carry them by myself. The burden is too heavy. So God promised meat, not just a little meat, but so much meat they'd be sick of it. You will eat it not just for 1 day or 2 days or 5, 10, or 20 days, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and you loathe it. And then the quail came, blown in by a wind from the sea. Quail so thick they covered the ground 3 feet deep around the camp. Quail so abundant you could just reach down and grab them. For 2 days the people gathered quail. Some gathered 50 bushels or more. They spread them out all around the camp, started cooking them, eating them, gorging on meat after years of manna. And while the meat was still between their teeth, before they'd even finished chewing, a plague struck the camp. People started dying. The place was named Kibroth-Hattaava, which means graves of craving, because that's where they buried the people who craved other food. The craving itself became deadly, not because meat was wrong, but because the craving revealed something deeper: discontent, ingratitude, a refusal to trust that God's provision was enough. And still the manna continued, every morning for 40 years, through all the complaining, all the rebellion, all the deaths and the wandering. The manna kept coming, consistent, reliable, boring, sustaining, 40 years of the same food. Think about that as you drift. Most of us can't eat the same lunch for a week without getting bored. Can't watch the same show twice without losing interest. Can't drive the same route without wanting variety. But they ate manna for 40 years. An entire generation grew up knowing only manna. Children who were born in the wilderness, who never tasted Egyptian fish or cucumbers. For them, manna wasn't boring yet, it was just food, the only food they'd ever known. Until finally, they crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land. And the day after they ate food from the land, produced from Canaan, the manna stopped. After 40 years, it simply stopped appearing, its purpose completed, its job done. And maybe, just maybe, some of them missed it. Maybe some of the older ones who remembered that first morning when they asked, "What is it?" Maybe they felt a strange nostalgia for the miracle they'd taken for granted for so long. Let this story settle over you like the dew that brought the manna. Let it remind you that even blessings can feel boring when we focus on what we don't have instead of what we do. That provision and variety are different things, and sometimes God gives us exactly what we need, even when it's not what we want. Rest now. Let the complaints fade. Let the craving ease. And just rest. Let's move forward in time now, past the wilderness wandering, past the conquest and the judges and the kings, all the way to a small region called Galilee, in the 1st century, where a carpenter-turned-rabbi was causing scandal, not primarily because of what he taught, but because of who he ate with. In that culture, as we've already discovered, meals were intimate. Sharing food meant sharing life, meant acceptance, meant fellowship. You didn't eat with just anyone. You ate with family, with friends, with people of similar social standing, with people who were ritually clean, with people who followed the same rules you did, the religious leaders. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were especially careful about this. They had rules upon rules about who was clean and unclean, who was acceptable and unacceptable, who was righteous and who was a sinner. And then along came Jesus, and he ate with everyone: tax collectors, These were Jews who had sold out to Rome, who collected taxes from their own people to give to the occupying empire, who often charged extra and pocketed the difference. They were traitors, collaborators, extortionists, and they were rich from their corruption. No respectable rabbi would be caught dead eating with a tax collector. It would be social suicide, spiritual contamination. It would validate their lifestyle, suggest that their behavior was acceptable. But Jesus? He called one as a disciple, Matthew, also called Levi, a tax collector working his booth. And Jesus walked up and said simply, "Follow me." And Matthew got up, left everything, and followed. And then Matthew threw a party, a big party, at his house. And he invited all his friends, who were, of course, other tax collectors and sinners. The text literally calls them sinners, probably prostitutes, people who didn't follow the religious laws, people with questionable occupations. And Jesus went. He reclined at the table. He dipped his hand into the same bowls they dipped their hands into. He ate. He laughed. He stayed for hours. The Pharisees were watching. They always seemed to be watching Jesus, and they were horrified. They asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" It was an accusation dressed as a question. Why does he contaminate himself? Why does he give them legitimacy? Why does he act like their behavior is acceptable when it's clearly not? Jesus heard them, and he answered, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." He flipped it, made the meal itself part of the healing. The table fellowship was the medicine. The acceptance was the treatment. The shared food was saying, "You're not too far gone. You're not unreachable. You're not beyond hope." This happened repeatedly. In Luke chapter 15, the Pharisees and teachers of the law were muttering, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." And in response, Jesus told 3 parables: the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son. All about God's joy when the lost are found. When the outcast comes home. Then there was Zacchaeus, another tax collector, a chief tax collector, actually, which meant he was even more corrupt, even richer, even more hated. And he was short. So when Jesus came through Jericho, Zacchaeus climbed a sycamore tree to see over the crowd. Jesus looked up, saw him, and said, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." Must stay. Not I'd like to, must. It's necessary. It's part of the mission. Zacchaeus came down, welcomed Jesus gladly, and all the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." Again, the issue wasn't just being near a sinner. It was eating with him, being in his home, accepting his hospitality, reclining at his table. These things meant approval, meant relationship, meant treating him like an acceptable person. And the meal changed Zacchaeus. Right there, in front of everyone, he stood up and said, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." The meal itself was transformative. Being accepted, being treated as worthy of Jesus' time and presence, being given dignity instead of contempt. It broke something open in Zacchaeus, made repentance possible, made change imaginable. Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house." Today, because of this meal, because of this acceptance. But it wasn't just tax collectors. There was Simon the Pharisee. who invited Jesus to dinner, probably to interrogate him, to figure out what kind of teacher he really was. And Jesus went. He reclined at the table in Simon's house, and then a woman came in, a woman known in the town as a sinner, probably a prostitute. She wasn't invited. She crashed the dinner party, and she stood behind Jesus at his feet as he reclined, and she began to cry. Her tears fell on his feet, and she wiped them with her hair, and kissed his feet, and poured perfume on them. Simon was disgusted. If this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. But Jesus knew exactly who she was, and he told Simon a parable. 2 people owed money. One owed a little, one owed a lot. Both were forgiven. Now which of them will love him more? Simon answered correctly. I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You're right, Jesus said, and then he pointed out. Simon had provided no water for Jesus' feet, no kiss of greeting, no oil for his head. But this woman, this sinner, had washed his feet with her tears, had kissed them repeatedly, had poured expensive perfume on them. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven as her great love has shown. The meal was the context for this whole encounter. Jesus was reclining, vulnerable, accessible, in a space where social rules said this woman shouldn't be. And instead of sending her away, instead of maintaining proper boundaries, Jesus received her worship, defended her, declared her forgiven. The early church struggled with this same issue. Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, clean and unclean. Who could eat with whom? It almost split the church. We'll get to that in our next story. But for now, let yourself imagine. What if meals still had this power? What if sharing food with someone who's different, who's struggling, who's an outsider? What if that itself was transformative? What if the table, your table, could be a place where grace happens, where acceptance heals, where outcasts find home? Rest in that possibility, the scandalous generosity of Jesus' table, where everyone was welcome, where no one was too far gone, where a shared meal could change everything. Now we come to the early church. Just a few years after Jesus' death and resurrection, the message is spreading. Jews are believing that Jesus is the Messiah, but then something unexpected happens. Gentiles start believing too. Non-Jews, people who eat pork, who don't circumcise their sons, who know nothing about Sabbath or kosher laws or ritual purity. And they want to follow Jesus too. They want to be part of this new community, which raises a massive question. Do they have to become Jewish first? Do they have to follow all the laws of Moses? And more practically, more immediately, can Jewish Christians eat with Gentile Christians? This wasn't a theoretical debate. This was hitting them at every meal, because the early church ate together. A lot. They had communal meals, love feasts, gatherings that combined worship and eating. It was central to their identity. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Breaking bread together, constantly. But how could a Jewish Christian eat with a Gentile? Christian when the Gentile didn't follow kosher laws, when they might serve pork, when they didn't wash ritually, when they were technically unclean? And then there was the meat problem in Corinth. This was a major issue that Paul had to address in his first letter to the Corinthian church. Here's the situation. In Corinth, a bustling port city with multiple pagan temples, when people made sacrifices to idols, to Zeus, to Aphrodite, to whichever god they were honoring, they'd bring an animal. The priests would perform the ritual sacrifice. Some of the meat would be burned on the altar. Some would go to the priests. And the rest? The rest would be sold in the marketplace, often at a discount, because there was a lot of it. So if you went shopping for meat in Corinth, much of what was available had been sacrificed to an idol first. It had been part of a pagan religious ceremony. For Jewish Christians, this was horrifying. This was idol meat, contaminated, unclean, compromised by association with false gods. They couldn't eat it. They wouldn't eat it. To do so would be participating in idolatry. But for Gentile Christians, especially those who were more educated, more philosophical, they reasoned differently. We know that an idol is nothing, that there's only one God, so the meat is just meat. The ritual didn't actually do anything to it because the gods don't exist. So why not buy it? It's cheaper. And it's food. Both groups were in the same church, trying to share meals together, and this issue was tearing them apart. Paul's response is brilliant and nuanced. He says, "You're both right and both wrong," to the Gentile Christians with the strong conscience who felt free to eat anything. Paul says, "You're technically correct. Food doesn't bring us near to God. We're no worse if we don't eat, and no better if we do. But be careful that your freedom doesn't become a stumbling block to the weak. If someone with a weak conscience sees you eating in an idol's temple, won't they be emboldened to eat what is sacrificed to idols, even though their conscience says it's wrong? So this brother or sister for whom Christ died is destroyed by your knowledge." In other words, yes, you have freedom, but love is more important than freedom. Don't use your freedom in a way that hurts someone else's faith. To the Jewish Christians with the weak conscience who couldn't eat the meat, Paul is gentler, but also challenging. He's essentially saying, your conscience matters. Follow it. Don't violate it. But also recognize that you're not more spiritual because you abstain. And don't judge those who have freedom you don't have. It's a both-and answer in a world that wanted either or. But then things got even more complicated. In Antioch, Peter, one of Jesus' original disciples, was eating with Gentile Christians, sharing meals, living out the unity of the gospel. But then some men came from James and Jerusalem, part of the circumcision group, Jewish Christians who believed Gentiles needed to fully convert to Judaism. And when Peter saw them coming, he withdrew. He stopped eating with the Gentiles. He separated himself, and other Jewish Christians followed his example. Even Barnabas, Paul's missionary partner, got swept up in it. Paul was furious. He saw this as betraying the gospel itself, so he confronted Peter publicly, in front of everyone. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter in front of them all, "You are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs?" Food had become a test case for the gospel. If Jewish Christians wouldn't eat with Gentile Christians, then the church would split. There would be a Jewish church and a Gentile church, separate, divided. The unity that Jesus prayed for, shattered. The Jerusalem Council, described in Acts chapter 15, tried to find a compromise. They decided that Gentile Christians didn't need to be circumcised, didn't need to follow the entire law of Moses, but they should abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood. These were minimum requirements, ways to make it possible for Jewish and Gentile Christians to eat together without violating core convictions. It was messy. It was complicated. It required grace and flexibility and patience from everyone. And even with these decisions, tensions continued for years. But here's what's remarkable. They kept trying. They kept eating together. They kept working it out, because meals mattered. Table fellowship mattered. The visual, tangible unity of different kinds of people sharing food was essential to the gospel message. Paul would later write to the Romans, "Accept the one whose faith is weak, without quarreling over disputable matters." One person's faith allows them to eat anything, but another, whose faith is weak, eats only vegetables. The one who eats everything must not treat with contempt the one who does not, and the one who does not eat everything must not judge the one who does, for God has accepted them. Food almost split the church, but ultimately, grace held them together. The willingness to prioritize relationship over preference, unity over uniformity, love over being right, and maybe, in our divided world, where we separate ourselves from people who think differently, vote differently, believe differently, maybe we need to remember this story. Maybe we need more meals together, not less. More willingness to sit at the same table with people who aren't like us, who don't agree with us. Because something happens when you share food, when you're vulnerable enough to eat together, when you practice the ancient art of breaking bread, person to person, hand to hand, bowl to bowl. Let that settle into your spirit now. The power of the table to unite, to heal, to transform, even when it's messy, even when it's complicated, even when it requires more grace than you think you have. Rest in the image of the early church, struggling, arguing, but staying at the table together, choosing unity, choosing love, choosing each other, over and over again. And so we've traveled a long way tonight, from ancient dinner tables where everyone reclined and ate with their hands, through marketplaces where meat was rare and precious, past wilderness camps where miracle food became monotonous, to scandalous parties where Jesus welcomed the wrong people, all the way to early church dinners where food became a test of the gospel itself. What strange and beautiful discoveries we've made. That eating grasshoppers was normal, that everyone's hands went into the same bowl, that burping was polite, that bone marrow was a treat while blood was forbidden, that who you ate with mattered more than what you ate. We've seen how food was never just food. It was identity. It was theology. It was relationship. It was survival. It was celebration. It was controversy. It was communion. The biblical world was strange to our modern eyes. No forks or refrigerators. No individual plates or food safety regulations. No separation between the sacred and the ordinary. Every meal was a little bit of both. And maybe, as you drift deeper into sleep now, you can feel a thread connecting their world to ours. Because we still gather around food. We still celebrate with meals. We still use dinner tables for the most important conversations. The details have changed, but the essential human need to eat together, to share, to belong, that hasn't changed at all. Next time you sit down to eat, maybe you'll pause for just a moment and think about the people who came before you, who tore bread with their hands, who licked their fingers clean, who shared bowls and trusted their neighbors, who argued about meat and idols, who welcomed outcasts to their tables, who tried to figure out how to eat together across impossible divides. They were so different from us, and yet so much the same, hungry, hoping, trying to figure out what it means to live together, to trust each other, to share life. Let yourself rest now in the warmth of ancient kitchens, the smell of bread baking in clay ovens, the sound of conversation around shared meals, the taste of wild honey and roasted locusts, the satisfaction of licking olive oil from your fingers, the joy of rare meat at a feast, the scandal of eating with the wrong people, the grace required to stay at the table when it would be easier to leave. Breathe slowly in and out. Your body is heavy, comfortable, supported. Your mind is quiet, drifting, letting go. May you rest well tonight, surrounded by these stories, these images, these people who lived and ate and struggled and celebrated thousands of years ago, but who are not so different from you. May you dream of shared bowls and communal tables, of grasshoppers and honey, of manna in the morning dew, of scandalous dinner parties and early church potlucks. May you remember that you are part of a long, long story, of people gathering around food, telling stories, breaking bread, and trying to figure out how to live. Rest now, deeply, completely. Let these ancient voices fade into silence. Let the images dissolve like morning mist. Let the sounds of those distant meals grow quiet. Breathe, rest, sleep comes now, gentle and complete, carrying you into dreams. And all is well, all is well, all is well.